Taking on proposals, I wanna know somebody who knows that it costs more money than you can ever see behind the money. You know, all about sit checking out, they're getting all into all of my lovely stimulation. I'm the holiday, I think that you concentrate to grow up. I said, check it out, they're getting on to yeah. My lovely stimulation. I've been coming day, I think what you gonna do, baby? Tell me what you gonna do. Hey, yeah. What you gonna do, baby?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and this is Frank Mcneil with Talk of the Town, and I am happy to be back. Sort of missed last week. There was a celebration called Juneteenth that I was at and had a great time. The city of Springfield really put on a great show last week, and I want to thank the Juneteenth organizers, Sharina Douglas, Tashiana Bankhead, Shamika Kerr. Let's see who else. Tashiana. Oh, our school board member, Erica Austin. And those young ladies really did a tremendous job of putting on a Juneteenth for everybody in Springfield. It was something for everybody, all races, and everybody enjoyed the Juneteenth celebration. And I'm so proud of what we've done with the Juneteenth event. And I think that more people in Springfield are beginning to recognize that this is a celebration for everyone. And it's not just for African Americans, but primarily for African Americans because, and I think I should give some of the history of why it's so important that we celebrate Juneteenth. As you know, in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves, basically a 13th Amendment. However, the Union troops had to come into previously Confederate held territory. Troops had to come in to make sure that they followed the law. And they did that in most of the states, South Carolina, Georgia, but the one state that didn't get the memo, I should say, was Texas. And it was June 19th, 1865, when 2,000 federal troops had to go into Texas to free the remaining slaves in Texas because they had not been freed. Now, we talk about law and order in this country, and man, here's the first case of, not wanting to follow law and order. So in 1865, Galveston, Texas, they marched in, freed the slaves. And then that is a celebration. And so you can recognize when Frederick Douglass did his great speech of why should he celebrate the 4th of July? Because up until 1865, really, all the slaves weren't free. So how could they celebrate the 4th of July when they weren't really free? Now, moving on, we have to talk about the fact that we as a people, United States of America, harbor some horrendous history that we don't want to share sometimes, and we don't share. And when we start going back to 1865 and the Juneteenth, and we start going, and from that point, we have all kinds of controversy because we were in a position where without the troops, without the troops being in place, things sort of started backtracking or backsliding. So when we start talking about freeing of the slaves, going into the 1860s, African Americans, we had congressmen out of Mississippi and Louisiana, South Carolina, North Carolina, until what? The Hayes-Tilden Compromise. And the Hayes-Tilden Compromise basically was Rutherford B. Hayes, in order to get to be the president of the United States, cut a deal. Take federal troops out of the South. And that's when you had the Black Codes and Jim Crow, all of this Ku Klux Klan, all became very prominent because they were turning back the tide. They were turning back, they were going to basically, if they couldn't enslave them, they put such onerous laws on them that African Americans then were under a whole different system. And if you really want to know some history, go look up the Black Codes in the 1860s. And that kind of segregation permeated this country until the late 60s, early 70s. So, and I talked about Byron Donalds, the congressman from Florida, a week or so ago. And for him to invoke Jim Crow in talking about how what the state of Black America was, and to say that we were more of a family during Jim Crow, it just shows the lack of understanding of his history and where he comes from. And he was born and raised in New York, and now he lives in Florida. And his life and his marriage, none of that would have been available to him in Jim Crow. And I doubt very seriously he would have been a congressman out of Florida after the introduction of Jim Crow. So what are we talking about here today? We're talking about how far we've come, but how far we have to go. 1967 was the Love's decision. And that's one thing that Byron Donalds should be very aware of, because that the Supreme Court struck down marriage. You could marry whoever you want. There was a law in Virginia where the Love's case was for that blacks and white could not intermarry. And I'm sure the same thing was prevalent in Florida. But the Love's decision changed that. And so thankfully, Supreme Court did its job. But here today, we have so many people chasing a vice presidency or chasing a conservatism that is etched in racism, that they've forgotten who they are and where they come from. And specifically, I'm talking about Tim Scott and Byron Donalds. They seem to be the front runners of who can be the biggest overseer. And if you know anything, and I'm a history minor, and I had a double minor. I was a history minor and a Black history minor. So I spent a lot of time studying our history and our culture. And one of the things that happened back in the day of slavery was when an African American or Black man could raise to the level where he was entrusted with overseeing other slaves, he was more onerous than the actual owner sometimes on the other slaves, because he wanted to make sure the master knew that he was taking care of business. And so as a result, they were sometimes more humiliating and beat slaves worse than what the master would do, because he didn't want any chance that the master say, you're not doing a good job, and therefore you're going to go back to your old self, and you'll have to be just a regular slave. And so that also created division among the slaves, which was also how they kept us enslaved for so long. And because we had a difficult time of getting ourselves together and making ourselves understand that slavery was not good for anybody other than the people who benefited from the fruits of the labor. And that's when, as they say, cotton was king. Uh, some people's families are still benefiting today from the wealth they accumulated from cotton. And how did they accumulate all this wealth? Because they had free labor. Free labor. When you don't pay for labor and you can sell the product, man, you make a lot of money because you don't have to pay anybody. And all you do is keep the slaves in subsistence, just make sure they stay alive so they can go pick cotton and do whatever chores they had to do, and you benefit. So, we in this country now, we're at a crossroads of trying to deny history. And every time we have some of the politicians who come on and they represent or try to make you forget about what has happened in this country, it's a strike against them because history is how we are where we are today. And I am so happy to know my history, and I don't have to worry about somebody having to tell me my history. And I try to impress upon young people, understand where you came from, understand your history, understand what you had to overcome, understand what we're still having to overcome. African American, the term, I'm an American. My forebearers were possibly African, of African descent. I haven't done any genetic testing. I don't know what all of my bloodlines are, but I know that my parents, my grandparents struggled through Jim Crow. They struggled with the onerous rules and regulations that were in place, that they couldn't have certain jobs, they couldn't live certain places, they couldn't go to school certain places. But they overcame. And they gave us a foundation to stand on for us to step up and say, hey, with an education, you can go where, do whatever you want to do. And I still believe that. I still believe that there is hope for this country, but we have to stand up and take our role and say to society, hey, we're going to be here. We're not going to let you turn back the clock, turn back the time. We're going to be a significant part of the governing bodies, the governing structure of this country, and whether you like it or not. Gerrymandering, still in play. Still, unfortunately, the Supreme Court of this nation is in a crisis right now. How can they rule that a congressional map is gerrymandering, but let it stand for another election? I mean, this is the kind of thing we're dealing with. They know. They had districts in Alabama, Louisiana, that they were gerrymandered. Nancy Mace, South Carolina, they ruled that it was gerrymandered, but they say it's got to stay in place until the next election. They're giving people seats. And we struggle to understand what's going on in our lives and why we need to be more educated, more cognizant of what's going on and how we are being duped There is a major election coming up in November of this year. And African Americans are being played again on both sides. But one thing I can say is that we have to stand up and understand that we are in a position where we can make the difference. Don't be fooled by the rhetoric that comes out of the mouths of the Byron Donalds of the worlds and the Tim Scotts of the worlds who can't even stand up and say, will you accept the results of an election? It wasn't African Americans who said to Donald Trump and the Republicans that this was the safest election and the most secure election and fair election. It was Chris Krebs, who was hired by the Trump administration to oversee the election. And he oversaw the election and said it was the safest, fairest election that we'd had. Now we got Project 25. They want to undo everything because they want things to go back to where you and I had no rights. And we were subjects, basically. And Donald Trump has told us he wants to be a dictator, and I believe him. And we have some of our African American brothers and sisters who have bought into it. They have bought into money. And there's no other way around it. Donald Trump understands what manipulates people in this money. That's why he was convicted in New York, because he used money to keep the silence of Stormy Daniels and the other young lady that he had affairs with and paid him off. That's why he was convicted, because he fudged the records. He put forth false records saying that these were for other purposes, and it was basically a payoff. Some of us don't seem to understand that's a crime. And had it been you and I, wouldn't have been any question where we'd be. We'd be gone. We'd be sitting back, sending letters home saying, things are bad here, and I just can't wait to come home. So, as we move forward, I'm hoping that we pay closer attention to what's going on in the world. We're in just extreme heat right now. We have forest fires, but yet still we got these people who say climate change is not upon us. They want to do away with regulations under Project 25. They want all of the people who regulate these kind of things to be gone. They want to reopen up fossil fuel. They say we can go back and use coal again. And we're still using coal right here in Springfield, but it's on a much limited basis. And it's much cleaner, and we have to pay quite a bit to use coal. But we have got to recognize that climate change is real. And each time we say climate change is not upon us, look at what happened in Florida. Look at what's happening in New Mexico. Look around the world and see what's happening with climate. It is extremely hot out there. Extremely hot, and we've got a hurricane season coming upon us that's going to be one of the worst. We're going to have flooding, and we still don't want to do anything about it. And as I move forward, we've got to talk about the bump stocks and the decision on bump stocks. and none other than Clarence Thomas, who wrote the opinion on bump stocks and allowed people to keep bump stocks. For the life of me, he hates himself. Clarence Thomas hates himself, and he hates that he is a black man. And he has done everything in his power to let people know that he doesn't side with us. And whatever the decision may be, he's always going to be on the opposite side of what the majority of African Americans believe. 8-1 decision. Clarence Thomas is the only one who wants domestic violators, domestic violence men, women, whoever they may be, to maintain firearms. I mean, we have to question it sometime. Why? What is he doing? Why does he want this way? And as you look at some of the decisions that have been penned by Clarence Thomas, it's clear to me that Clarence Thomas has a real problem with himself and looking at himself in the mirror and recognizing that he is a black man. He can marry whoever he wants to marry. He has free speech under the Constitution, but doesn't mean we have to agree with him. And he's done, in my opinion, very little, if anything, to promote the welfare of African Americans. And his job as a Supreme Court justice is not to promote the welfare, but to make a clear, cogent decision based on the facts and stare decisis precedent. And he hasn't done that. And that's the issue that I have with Clarence Thomas. And now we are in a state where we don't even know if the ruling on the immunity that the former president is trying to con his way into, what is Clarence Thomas and the rest of those guys, Alito, who still probably flying the flag upside down, what are they going to say? It's pretty clear to me that this is going to be a mixed bag of things that comes out. But it only hurts this country. And these guys supposedly took an oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution of the state from foreign and domestic. And it just seems like they're not doing it. So as we move forward, ladies and gentlemen, I just wanted to have an opportunity. I'm going to try to get some scenes from Juneteenth last week and the great performance from Morris Day and the Time and Morris Day, a local Springfield talent. I knew his father. I met his brother for the first time last week, Jesse Jr., and had a long conversation with him. A really great young man. Grew up here in Springfield as well. But Juneteenth, the history, the celebration that we all should take part in is something that America needs to embrace as a whole. The fact that Joe Biden made this a national holiday, I feel is something special. I think that we need to recognize the history of our country and that everybody wasn't free until June 19th, 1865. So I'm going to cash out right here, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate you joining in to Talk of the Town. Just want to share a little knowledge with you, a little understanding. And let me give a shout out to my sponsor, Sagaman Watches, and my good friend Brian Sue. And you can buy watches. You can also have watches repaired. Picture Perfect Solutions with my good man Steve and Boyd's New Generation Restaurant. All right, ladies and gentlemen, talk to you next week.